Grow, Sell, and Retire is the podcast for the lazy overachiever. BD Dalton, author of The Assisted Purchase, True Gravity, and Grow, Sell, and Retire, is here to give his 25 years of secrets, tips, and assistance to take your business to the next level. This podcast is for anyone who wants to sell more, work less, and make better business. Now, here's your host, BD, with today's GSR podcast.
Hey everybody, BD Dalton here, Grow, Sell, and Retire podcast. I'm looking forward to today's interview. Got a celebrated author, award-winning thinker, and we'll talk about that a little bit, strategic visionary, and I've got Michael Watkins here, and we're going to talk about his new book and the plethora of books that he has out there. But Michael, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about you and a little bit about the new book that's coming out.
Sure. Thanks, BD. Well, just delighted to spend some time with you. I'm a academic originally, so Harvard Business School, and then now professor of leadership and organizational change at IMD Business School in Lausanne, Switzerland. And I also co-founded a consulting company. I'm best known for the first 90 days, right? You know, I like to joke, BD, that I've written 14 books at this point, one of which sold almost 2 million copies in English at this point, and the others which sold 50 copies each. That's a joke. It wasn't quite that bad. But so I've got big hopes for this new one, right? A bit of a departure, a new subject area for me. I've mostly been writing about leadership and transitions for a long time. Strategic thinking, the 6 disciplines of strategic thinking is the title, and I'm looking forward to talking with you about it.
That's cool, because I think right now is, and I'm not a doomsayer or anything else, but I do think we're working in challenging times, both geopolitically and business-wise. And I think we're coming into something that's going to, if it doesn't already, feel like a recession. So I think that people need to really sit back and spend some time outside of their business instead of inside of it. So strategy is key here. So could you walk me through the 6 principles, just headline, and then I really want to test you out with some questions and awesome. Have hopefully some fun with the 6 disciplines.
Awesome. Well, so just before we do that, though, I think what you just said is so super important, right? Which is, I don't think there's been a time in recent history that we've faced more challenges than we face today, right? There's enormous turbulence economically, socially, technologically. And if you're not thinking strategically, I think you're going to be in deep trouble, right? Because there's going to need to be a sense of making fairly continuous pivots and changes and responding to what's going on. And I when I talk about these days, I say, strategic thinking is essential. It's not enough. You need organizational agility. You need personal resilience, right? There's a package of things we're going to need to get through all this, but don't think you can do it without strategic thinking.
That's cool. So let's go. We'll hit on them, but then I want to come back to a couple of them that I think are very pertinent for the audience. So go for the six different strategies.
Sure. So the basic organizing framework is you as a leader need to be able to recognize, prioritize, and mobilize to deal with emerging challenges and opportunities, right? That's the frame. And then the question is, what are the mental disciplines that let you do that? Right. And that's how I've conceptualized strategic thinking, is in terms of that recognize, mobilize, prioritize cycle you need to be going through and around. It happens to have the initials RPM. That's not an accident, right? So getting around to this faster is better. Then the mental disciplines that support it, pattern recognition, right? The ability to see important, consequential, relevant patterns in the midst of a sea of noise. I was trained originally as an engineer, electrical engineer, and so we used to talk about signal to noise ratio, right? And how you extract the signal from the midst of the noise. Mm-hmm. Pattern recognition. And if you're not recognizing patterns, none of the rest of it matters that much, right? Number 2, systems thinking, right? So how do you understand action and reaction? How do you understand that if something happens over here, it's likely to spin out over here and create a feedback loop down there and hit you in the foot over here, right? And so that systems thinking is a really key piece of it. Number 3, mental agility. And here, a couple of things we can talk about, right? One is a CEO I know describes it as cloud to ground thinking, right? Mm-hmm. How do you go from the big picture to the details, but be intentional about what altitude you're flying at? And then I packaged with that under mental agility, the sort of chess master skills of looking forward a couple moves and thinking about what your best reaction is given what the competitive and social environment is likely to do. Those three things basically are the recognize and prioritize part of the RPM cycle, but then you got to mobilize the organization, right?
Yes.
So number 4 is structured problem solving. How do you take a team through a process of really framing and solving the right problems is the way I describe it. Visioning. So how do you establish a vision of a desirable but achievable future and then work backwards from that to what are we going to do, right, to get there? And why should we be excited about getting there? And the third, and this is one that I think is going to come as a surprise to some folks being included in strategic thinking, but it's political savvy, right? It's the ability to understand the political currents, understand power and influence, critically build alliances to mobilize the energy you need to achieve your goals.
So when we're talking politics, it's not always, we're not talking governmental politics always. It's about internal politics in your competitors, in the local chamber, in things like that. So understanding that big vision of the politics of dealing with people.
Yes. And, much of what business leaders need to do these days is shaped by regulation.
Mm-hmm.
It requires, approvals of varying forms. I've been working with a CEO who's gone through a whole series of acquisitions in the last 4 or 5 years. And of course, every one of them required many levels of governmental approval, right? And so you're engaging absolutely politically internally, but also externally.
Very good. So you give us a bunch of stuff there, and they're all great. So a couple of challenges here for you.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. I'm ready.
Okay, here it goes. So you've gotten in a time machine, and you can go back to any company in time that was creating a vision. So somebody that maybe we all know, but it doesn't have to be. But what company would you choose to be able to sit in their boardroom and help them or watch them design their vision that they've delivered, hopefully well or poorly?
So I'm going to give you one that's really obvious, and your audience is going to go, that was just such an easy one to come up with. But I'm going to give it a little twist that I think makes it a bit more interesting, right? So I would love to have been able to see Steve Jobs conceptualize the early Apple Mac, revolutionize computing forever. I would love to have been there to see that. He was a complicated guy. But, there's no denying he was an absolute visionary. So, but that's kind of that's an easy one. The one that's related to him that I think is really fascinating is Pixar, right? Mm-hmm. So, Pixar, Toy Story, Bugs Life, Cars. And actually, Steve Jobs was a co-founder of Pixar. I'm not sure how many people know that. But he also had this amazing guy named John Lasseter, who was one of the founding members of Pixar, the chief creative officer. He directed most of those early hits. And I would have loved to have sat around the table when they figured out, the vision for Pixar, because even I, as an adult, loved taking my kids to those movies, right? I loved taking my kids to those movies. I enjoyed it as much as the kids did, maybe more, because of something they did, right? They changed, animation from the kind of the somewhat tired sort of Disney formula of Snow White into something that just had a really interesting edge to it. And I would have loved to have seen that.
So when you're consulting people, so if we were sitting in there and we pretended like now you're sat with me and I have a manufacturing business and I'm thinking this is a bunch of hogwash vision. It's like that's just something you write on a wall and do that stuff. How do we take it from that process to delivering movies and entertainment that engages parents and creates people that can sit on a couch and have a family time? It's not about the movie, it's about the experience. How do I apply that to a manufacturing business or a small services business?
So I think it's harder, right? Because you don't have the scope necessarily to shape things from the absolute outset the way you do. But, I always counsel people to look for the purpose and look for the vision in what you're doing, right? And if there's no purpose and there's no vision, then why are you doing it would be a question I would ask, right? I mean, but I think when you engage even, small business owners, they have a sense of purpose often for what they're doing, right? There was a reason why they're engaged in what they're engaged in. And often they do have a vision for what they're trying to accomplish, right? Now, to your point, going from vision to reality is hard. Execution is an underrated, I mean, we say vision, right? Vision, but no, execution is tremendously important, right? To make things happen. So you need both, right? In equal measure. But I'd certainly tell those smaller business folks or mid-sized business folks, especially with younger generations today, they connect with purpose, right? So you have to be able to have a purpose and articulate a purpose if you're really going to mobilize their energy.
That's very good. So if you were talking about at the very beginning when you were explaining it, and because this is audio, you didn't see Michael's hands flying all over the place, but you talked about, when you're talking about system thinking. So can you explain a time when something happened in a business that happened over here to the right hand, but you didn't know it swung back around and hit somebody in the foot, like you said in your explanation? Is there an idea of something that we can think about? I didn't think that was going to affect that as much as it did in a company that could be a good example.
I'm going to give you two examples, Beatty, but they're not quite exactly what you asked for, but I think you're going to like them anyway, right? So the first is one that's described in the book, which is the ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? One ship, one canal, seemingly not a very big deal, disrupted, global trade for 6 months or more, right? Mm-hmm. And why is that the case? Because you've got this very intricate network of interconnections. People were running very lean, right? In terms of, manufacturing just in time, inventories. They were sourcing from long distances away. Mm-hmm. And you cut one little critical cord and it just starts to propagate through the entire system, right? And pretty soon, many, many, many companies are suffering severe supply chain difficulties. So that would be one I give you. The other was one I actually have a slight personal twist to. And again, it's not exactly it impacted business, right? Which you may remember. And it was in 2010, there was a big volcanic eruption in Iceland. Mm-hmm. Do you remember this?
Yes, I got stuck.
There you go. Okay, you got stuck.
I couldn't leave. I think we were in Spain and I couldn't leave because the ash cloud had reached over into Europe and they didn't know how to fly in the airspace.
Well, so exactly, right. And my personal connection to this, and it sounds somewhat similar to yours, is I got the last flight out of London to Boston before they closed it down, right? I was sitting in Heathrow, looking up at the screen, of the flights, and it's cancel, Boston. And I got on it, and I remember looking out the window and there was kind of this reddish, color out the window, right? But just think about that. That's one volcano, seemingly maybe not such a big deal, but over 100,000 flights were canceled, right? Created enormous disruption. One of the estimates is that almost $2 billion was lost in the process of doing that. It completely changed the regime for dealing with airspace management. It also disrupted supply chains again, right? Because often very critical components are flying, by FedEx, to China or from China, right? It created political issues. And so, to me, the hallmark of these, of systems is that dead set of interconnections, right? And therefore some fragility that comes from having a network like that. Mm-hmm. But then there's also just the action and reaction, right? Of being able to create these mental models of the way things work that let us navigate through the world. Great strategic thinkers have great mental models, which are basically systems models in the way we think about it.
That is really good. So we kind of led off with the challenging times and everything else. So we talk about resources, talk about strategic thinking when it comes to leveraging resources. Talked a little bit about Pixar, and I know it's not a Pixar movie, but Ratatouille. It's all about cooking. It's all about ingredients. It's all about bringing all this stuff back around. So if we were to look at our businesses, and you were the strategic chef coming into a business right now with limited resources, what are you going to want on the menu or in the recipe to deliver something for whatever is limited resources? Yeah. And so what are you looking at with strategic thinking there?
So first of all, Ratatouille, right? I hate eggplant, BD, just for the record, right? And my Greek wife despairs of me for this, right? So I'm not making Ratatouille, that's for sure. So this was an interesting one. if you think about entrepreneurship, right? And there's been some great stuff written about kind of the theory of entrepreneurship and how it works. And there's a particular school of thought that actually was developed in large measure by a colleague of mine at IMD called effectuation.
Okay.
And effectuation basically says, rather than set a goal and work towards it, figure out what you got and what you can do with it, right? And so one of the foundational principles of effectuation and entrepreneurship is called the bird in the hand principle, right? You start with what you have, who you are, who you know, what they know, and sort of work from there into what's possible and let it evolve, right?
Yes.
And so then, a good example of this is the way Airbnb got going, right? Do you know the story of how Airbnb got going?
No, it's enlighten. I mean, I've heard bits. Yeah. Give me your take.
So you got two founders, right? Living out in San Francisco with normal jobs and struggling to pay their rent. And in 2007, there was a big conference in San Francisco, and every hotel in the city was booked. And they saw an opportunity, right? So they had this apartment, their apartment, in a city without a whole lot of accommodation, right? And so they set up a website, right? And rented out air mattresses, if you can believe it, on their living room floor.
Airbnb. Yeah.
Airbnb. There you are, right? And so, and it really kind of went from there, right? What they then started, because they had, IT experience, building this online platform, beginning to connect people needing accommodation with those that had it available, right? And to me, it's just a great example of this sort of principle of working with what you have and kind of growing something out of that, right? So obviously, that was an example I came up with around resources.
That's really good. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about having some fun in decision making. So if you were to play a little bit of decision making roulette, and you were able to look at something and spin the wheel.
Yep.
What's something that you made a gamble on, spun the wheel, and it came out good? Because I know you used to live in the States, now you live in Switzerland. So what's something in your business life, or even in one of your clients' business lives, that you thought, this is never going to work, spin the wheel, and they came out a winner in this? And then how do you capitalize on that luck of the draw?
So, I think one of the CEOs I work with, his name is Gene Woods, and he's actually also featured in the book. He started out with a relatively modest-sized healthcare system in the Southeast. And after 7 years is now leading the third largest nonprofit healthcare system in the country, right? And he did it through a series of deals that nobody thought was possible. Right. But he had a vision for them, and he had the political savvy, honestly, to make it happen. Right. And he's, to me, if someone asked me who's a great strategic thinker, he's one of the people I point to for sure. Yeah. But I got this question is an intriguing question, right? Because I think that it also goes to, what do you do, when you see something isn't working necessarily, or isn't working the way you want? And do you have the stuff to then make a pivot? Right. That was another way I kind of think about the question you're asking. Right. And the example that came up for me there was Instagram. Right.
Yes.
And again, this is the founding, kind of not myths, but the realities of them. Right. So it was originally named Bourbon, believe it or not. Started out as a location-based app like Foursquare, basically, where you could check in and do stuff like that. And then they just realized it was already a highly competitive space, and they weren't really getting traction. But they noticed that users were more engaged with the photo sharing aspect of the app. And so they made this decision to strip away everything except for the photos and the documents and the other stuff like that, right? And that was the creation, and they changed the name to Instagram, right? Which is, I think, some mixture of like instant photo and Telegram or something. I don't know.
Yeah.
But it doesn't matter. And this thing just took off like a rocket, right? And so to me, that's, is it roulette exactly? Maybe it's just, hey, we know this isn't going to work if we don't make the change, but you still got to have some,
and do you see that when
make a change.
do a lot of people, that you see out there and the experiences and the books that you've written and all this type of stuff, do people from that behavioral finance side sit on that sunk cost fallacy a lot?
Absolutely, right. No. So I think this is the right linkage, right? Which is there are reasons why people tend not to be willing to make pivots like that when they should, right? And you have to overcome some of those biases, risk aversion being one, the sunk cost fallacy being another really critical one, right? So, what is it that lets some people basically say, okay, bourbon isn't working, right? We're gonna create something different. We're just gonna throw the dice, right? Actually, I guess spin the wheel in your metaphor of the roulette stuff. The other example I thought was kind of an opposite example, and maybe it kind of proves your point a little bit, right, about sunk costs and so on, which was Nokia competing with Apple early 2000s. And they built a touchscreen internet-enabled smartphone, right? They had a prototype, right?
Yes.
But they decided, that they weren't, it was not that big a deal. It was minor. They had this tremendously booming, share of the mobile phone market, right? And so they didn't pursue it. And we know the history of that, right?
Yes. Hero to zero.
And I think it goes to some of those biases you're talking about in behavioral economics, right? In the sense, it's kind of sunk cost, but it's also a failure to realize that, yes, you have a dominant position today, but if you don't take the choices to continue to go and innovate, you can end up with, you can end up like Nokia, right? Which is kind of too bad.
So if we're coming into the end of the year, we're coming into a reset, we're coming into a visionary thing. What are three questions that an SLT, a senior leadership team, or CEO, or whoever else should be asking themselves right now to kind of look forward and think strategically? Because people want a practical thing. We've talked about Nokia and all these big companies, but how do I apply this to a 200, 300, 400, 500 person company to make something that I could say today, this actually worked?
So I think that the answer lies in that recognize, prioritize, mobilize cycle, and just really getting clear on what your company does to do that today, right? I mean, I work through questions when I work with executive teams about setting, overall strategic direction for organizations, right? What do you want to do? Why should people get excited? How are you going to shape the culture? But the number one question is, where are we? And do we have a shared view of reality? And are we staying in tune with what's happening, right? Recognizing, sensing and responding to what's going on appropriately. And to me, that's the number one thing I would sort of talk with my team about. I would be testing, first of all, do we have a shared view of reality? Reality of the customer, reality of the political environment we're operating in, right? Reality of what the potential risks are we're facing, right? And really testing and pushing on that pretty hard, which I think you can do, in any size of business. And then I think it's then, okay, well, how are we engaging in a way that lets us recognize, prioritize, mobilize to see emerging challenges and emerging opportunities, right? What's our logic for doing that? What are our systems for doing that? How do we gather information? How do we process that information, right? That's where I'd sort of be focusing first, because that's the basis then for all the work you then do to make good strategic decisions. But if you don't have a shared reality as a leadership team and you're not staying in tune with what's going on, you're heading over a cliff.
Yeah, and people don't realize that, especially when things are going decently. May not be going great or as good as they used to, but people get that when the tide goes out, you see who's wearing swim trunks from Warren Buffett. I think we're headed to a little bit of the tide going out, so people need to put their swim trunks on. So it's
absolutely.
So when we're looking at this, and I'm a big sports fan, and you can take this analogy in whichever direction you want to go, but I'm a football fan. So how does a coach look at a team and get the vision, besides score more goals, get the vision and the team to line up? And then how do we kind of take that into the business setting? So how do we get the team to line up with everything we just talked about, with the direction of travel and the goals? How do we now get the workers that are on the pitch to do what they're supposed to do?
Yeah. So this is a fun question, right? And I live in Europe, as you know, and so when you said football, I interpreted it as soccer, right? You wanted me to talk about soccer. I'm joking, right? What I actually did was think a little bit about the difference between soccer and American football as metaphors for execution and the relative advantages of those two, right? I mean, soccer, you've got a lot of flexibility. It moves very quickly. It's very fluid. You've got to change and adapt on the fly. There's a lot of creativity typically in the game, right? Whereas in American football, you typically have the more defined roles, the planned and structured execution, right? The more centralized decision making, right? The calls from the side of the field. And so to me, the two types of football basically represent two models of how you execute. And I think you need both, right? You need the part of soccer that's about the fluidity, the adaptability, the flexibility, the teamwork, but the team that knows each other's moves, right? And you need the ability to plan and execute and assign roles and have a disciplined approach to running a play in the same way that you do in American football, right? So to me, it's, the right answer is a mixture of the two kinds of football, if that makes any sense. Yeah. I guess I would say, though, given the turbulence you talked about and we've discussed, that adaptability is really absolutely essential today, right? Now, but you see that in American football too, right? You see people adapting the plays they play, deciding what plays they're going to run. So it's not like American football is an adaptive game. It certainly is, right? But maybe not as fluid as soccer is. But anyway, I think it's a super interesting question. I know, by the way, sports metaphors I think can be really helpful and interesting, right, for thinking about these things.
They bring a lot of people along, I think. So you're a big thinker, and tell me about the award you just won, because there's 50 involved, and you were just recently in London. So
I was.
So cool. Yeah. So what was the award, and how did it come about?
Sure. So there's an organization called Thinkers 50, and every 2 years they rank the top 50 management and leadership thinkers in the world, right? So, and some people call it the Academy Awards of Management and Leadership, right? And so they hold this every 2 years, big gala in London, black tie affair, and they run it like the Oscars, right? The candidates are, the winner is. And so, which is great, right? And I actually went on the Thinkers 50 originally back in 2019. And I stayed on it again in 2021, right? Because you can fall off the Thinkers 50 too, right? You're a former Thinkers 50, older, right? But actually this year they decided to give me particular recognition in the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame.
Wow.
And the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame is basically kind of the Lifetime Achievement Award equivalent,
Yes.
for my overall career achievements. And the nice thing about that is once named to that, they can't take you off, right? So
you're there for life. You can't make me leave. I'm furniture.
And I have two jokes about it, right? One was when I heard, I thought, oh, this is great, but I was really hoping for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame,
Yes.
Yes. And the other was that I quickly went to the list and checked out who else was on the Thinkers 50 Hall of Fame and was quite relieved to find that most of them were also still alive.
So you weren't the only living member of the Thinkers 50. Yes. Oh. We need a live one. Everybody else is gone.
Exactly.
Bring one in that's still with us. So that's cool. So where can we find out more about you?
Sure. So probably easiest place is LinkedIn, right? I do my own LinkedIn, work basically and answer messages and respond. And it's almost certainly the single best place to get me.
Cool. And where can we buy the book?
Everywhere. But not until January 9th. Because you can pre-order it now on Amazon.
But the good thing is this will be coming out right about January 9th. So it'll be ready to go.
That's perfect.
That will be good. So here's the rewind segment. So one top tip that if somebody just catches the last minute of the podcast, they'll rewind and say, hey, I need to hear everything that Michael had to say. So how about your one top tip that we can apply today?
Yeah. If you're not prepared to adapt, you're going to die. If you're not a good strategic thinker, you won't be prepared to adapt. If you don't ensure your team is on the same page about reality and able to respond to what's going on, you won't be able to think strategically.
That's amazing. Michael Watkins, thank you so much for coming on the Grow, Sell, and Retire podcast. It's been amazing to have you on.
Thanks, BD. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us on Grow, Sell, and Retire. For more information, tools, or to book one of our team members to work with your team, business, or to speak at your event or conference, visit rockfind.co.uk. If you like the podcast, you'll love one of BD's 3 books, The Assisted Purchase, True Gravity, and the book the podcast is based on, Grow, Sell, and Retire. If you want to work for the rest of your life, that is your business. If you don't, that is ours.